Hey everyone, ready to dive into a big one. Today we're tackling a question that sparked centuries of debate. Is Jesus the creator God?
And you are in the right place if you want to really impress people at your next theological debate.
We're diving deep into an article from Answers in Depth called Is Jesus the Creator God? By Bodie Hodge, and let me tell you, this article does not hold back.
No kidding. It comes right out and says the stakes are about as high as they get.
Like what? Higher than?
Well, the article poses this question. If Jesus isn't God, if he's just some being that God created, then how could he possibly have the power to atone for sins against an all-powerful God? It argues that the whole foundation of Christianity hinges on that question.
Whoa, okay, I see where this is going.
Right. It really makes you think about what you believe about Jesus.
It does. So the article is coming at this from a very specific perspective. It even talks about how other faiths view Jesus.
Yeah, it touches on the diversity of thought surrounding Jesus. Like in Islam, he's seen as a prophet, a messenger of God, but not divine in the same way Christians believe.
And even within Christianity, there are different interpretations,
Yeah,
right?
oh, absolutely. But this article presents a very specific, very literal interpretation of the Bible, especially when it comes to Colossians 1:16, which says, and I'm paraphrasing here, all things were created by him and for him.
So the article uses this verse to support its argument that Jesus is the active force behind creation. But this is where the deep dive really begins, because it doesn't just present this as a matter of faith. It goes on to examine, and let's be honest, critique opposing viewpoints.
And the main battleground for this theological showdown is John 1:1 to 3.
Okay, so John 1:1 through 3, the one that says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." I feel like I've heard this verse a million times, but I never realized how much debate there was around it. What's the big deal with this passage?
It's wild how much this passage means to different people, and it really all comes down to that word.
Right, because the article we're looking at, it's saying that Word refers to Jesus,
Yeah.
and it uses this to support the idea that Jesus is God.
Exactly. But not everyone sees it that way, and that's where things get interesting. The article really seems to want to take on the Jehovah's Witnesses and how they interpret this.
So how do Jehovah's Witnesses see it differently?
Well, they have their own translation of the Bible called the New World Translation, or NWT, and it's their translation of John 1:13 that's a major point of contention.
What do they say?
Instead of saying the Word was God, the NWT says the Word was a God.
Just adding an A there seems like a small change grammatically, but makes a huge difference.
Right. Theologically, it's a completely different ballgame.
So why is that little a such a big deal?
Because, as the article points out, saying a God suggests that Jesus is a separate being from God, not equal to God. Like, imagine a king and a prince. The prince might have some power, some authority, but he's not the king himself.
Okay, so it's about whether Jesus is on the same level as God or a step down.
Exactly. And the article we're discussing argues that this goes against the traditional Christian belief in the Trinity, which says that God is three persons, Father, Son, Jesus, and Holy Spirit, all equal, all one God.
So for the article, the Trinity is a really big deal, and this NWT translation totally messes with that. But before we go any further, can we back up a bit? For those of us who might not be total theology nerds, what exactly does the Trinity mean?
Good point. The Trinity is one of those theological concepts that can be hard to wrap your head around. It basically means that even though we talk about God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, it's not three separate gods, but one God in three persons.
Okay, that makes a little more sense. So back to John 1:1 to 3, the article claims that the NWT translation goes against this idea of the Trinity. But is the NWT the only translation that sees it this way?
Well, that's what the article wants us to think. It points to all these other translations like the NIV, the KJV, and others that all translate that Greek word theos as God, basically saying, look, all these other translations agree with us, so the NWT must be wrong.
So the article is really building a case that its interpretation is the most widely accepted one. But it doesn't stop there, right? It brings in some serious historical figures to back up its claims.
They sure do. They mention this guy, Ignatius, who was a disciple of John the Apostle. You know, the same John who actually wrote the Gospel of John.
Oh.
Yeah, and they say that Ignatius referred to Jesus as God in his letters, so that must mean even the early Christians believed in Jesus' divinity.
So it's like they're saying if John's own student understood it this way, who are we to argue?
Right, but here's where it gets even more interesting. The article doesn't just focus on the Jehovah's Witnesses. They also bring up that some Muslims use John 1:1-3 to argue against the divinity of Jesus.
Wait, Muslims using a Bible verse to argue about Jesus. I'm confused.
Yeah, it's all about context, isn't it? The article doesn't get too deep into the Islamic perspective, but it suggests that some Muslims use John 1:1-3 to say that Jesus was created by God just like everything else. Remember how the verse says, "In the beginning was the Word"?
Right.
Well, if you view the Quran as the ultimate truth, you might interpret beginning as referring to the creation of Jesus, not the beginning of, well, everything.
Okay, so you have different faiths, different scriptures, different interpretations, all coming from these few lines.
Exactly. It's fascinating how much our starting point shapes our perspective. And this article we're discussing comes from a place where the Bible, specifically their interpretation of it, is the ultimate truth. So they argue that to really know what John meant, we have to look at how the very first Christians understood these words.
And they bring up Ignatius again as their key witness.
Right. They're essentially saying that if this early church leader, who supposedly learned directly from John's disciple, believed Jesus was God, well, then that settles it.
Like trying to draw a direct line back to the source.
Exactly. And by doing so, they're implying that anyone who interprets it differently is breaking from that tradition. But, you know, even if we accept the Bible as the ultimate authority, there's still so much room for debate about what it actually means.
It's true, and it makes this conversation so interesting. It's not just about who Jesus was, it's about how we read, interpret, and understand these ancient texts.
You got it. And that's something this article doesn't fully address. It presents its very specific interpretation as the interpretation. But throughout history, people of faith have wrestled with these questions, and there's never been just one easy answer.
So where does that leave us?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is to be aware of the different perspectives out there. This article makes some strong claims, but it's important to remember it's presenting one perspective among many.
Definitely. Whether you agree with it or not, it gets you thinking. Like if believing in Jesus as the creator God is essential for salvation, as the article says, what does that mean for people of other faiths? Or for people who have a different understanding of who Jesus is?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's what makes these deep dives so important. We may not have all the answers, but asking the questions, exploring these different viewpoints, that's what helps us learn and grow.
I love that. So to everyone listening, keep those questions coming, keep diving deep into the topics that make you think, and we'll be here to explore them with you. Until next time.